Welcome to episode 5 of the Delancey Throne podcast. Quickly before we get into it, I'd like to mention that you can now listen to the podcast on the go via SoundCloud. Just search Delancey Throne on there or follow a link that I'll have in the description. On today's episode, I'm joined by Airdorf of Airdorf Games. Airdorf is the sole developer of The Wind, a game based off the 2019 movie of the same name, as well as his exceptional Faith series that he's best known for. I'd like to say that unfortunately I had some issues with Discord whilst recording this, so there's certain parts where Airdorf cut out from me, and I may have missed one or two things that I would have liked to have asked or maybe explored, so I do apologise for that. Luckily, he'd recorded his portion during the podcast also, so I've spliced them together, and I think it sounds pretty good. With that being said, I thoroughly enjoyed this episode. Airdorf is a genuinely lovely guy, and it was an absolute pleasure chatting to him about his processes, a real great insight. Enjoy.
Hey, doing okay, Reese? Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on, I really appreciate it. I discovered your games fairly recently, actually, and I'm pretty sure you'll probably know where I discovered your games. It was from a Ragnarok's video.
Oh, okay, great, yeah.
Yeah, and as soon as I saw the art style, I was like, this looks fucking badass. And I straight away went to Itch.io, downloaded them, played them, and I was absolutely blown away by them. So, how long have you been?
Thanks so much.
How long have you been creating games?
Oh man, so it depends on what you call a game. Like when I was a kid, I was real into make believe, and I don't know if you ever read Calvin and Hobbes by Bill Watterson.
I can't say I have, unfortunately.
Yeah, Bill Watterson was a cartoonist in the U.S. and he made a long-running series called Calvin and Hobbes. And Calvin is this very imaginative, creative boy who has a stuffed tiger that comes to life around him, and named Hobbes. And Calvin is anything but conventional. When you throw him into an organized sport, he makes up his own sport, or he pretends that he's like on a distant planet and he's a space explorer, and he easily gets distracted by his own, his own fantasies and stuff. And that's pretty much how I was when I was a kid. I would make up lots of games and things. And then when I discovered video games, I was around 6. And as soon as I held my original Game Boy with Link's Awakening cartridge in my hands and started playing, I became obsessed, and I knew that I really wanted to make games eventually. And so when I was in junior high school, so I would have been 12, I think. So around the time I was 12, I discovered this. I really liked Zelda because I really liked Link's Awakening. It was huge. It was the first video game I ever owned, and huge impact on my life and on my creative work. And I discovered this program called Zelda Classic, and that's how I got my start. It was Zelda Classic. It's still around. It's this it's basically a customizable modding tool for the original ROM for the original Legend of Zelda. And ever since then, it's expanded to include a few more mechanics that are more like the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance Zelda games. And I made my first game. You can still find it on ZeldaClassic.com. It's called Quest for Hyrule, and it's just a rearranging, a remix of the first Zelda game. And then I I would make those. They're called quest files, and so I made a couple of custom quests for Zelda Classic when I was in junior high, and then in high school I poured all my energy into a really big one that took like a year to make, and I had to like my parents didn't understand, so I had to kind of like sneak around when they weren't looking and get on the family computer and keep working and stuff. And so those were my first experiences, but the most important thing that I learned from that is uh, was the value of putting your game out there on the internet and publishing it. And there's a really good Zelda Classic community, and everybody's really helpful, but they're also very critical, and you get a lot of good feedback. And so that was kind of an early on. I kind of learned the do's and don'ts, mostly don'ts of game design. And
So you really
some
kind of...
guy.
Sorry, no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I it was mostly bad game design. um, but I really I enjoyed making it, and I even saw a YouTuber do a Let's Play recently, or I say recently, but like 4 years ago, of the last one that I made, and I felt really bad for him because of how difficult it got towards the very end. But he persevered and beat it, and I was like, man, that's amazing. And um, and so I didn't make games for a really really long time. Uh, Games were tolerated at my house growing up, but they weren't like learning coding and learning game design wasn't exactly encouraged. And I don't really blame my parents for that. I mean, they started getting exposed to video games like during the 80s and 90s when like there was legislation trying to crack down on content and a lot of politicians in the U.S. especially were kind of preaching about games being this kind of blight on society and being bad for kids. And I think the jury's still out on that. I don't know if they're good or bad for people, but I loved them, and I would spend all my time playing games and thinking about games and talking about games. Then finally got the chance to take some game design courses in college, maybe 5 years ago or so, and I published another game. It was really small. It was just on like a Google page, and then I went on to start Airdorf when I just like couldn't take it anymore, and I wanted to make a good horror game because I really liked horror games.
How much experience did you actually have with coding then before you decided to? I know obviously you said that you had some experience with Zelda and things like that, but what programming language did you code the Faith games and the Wind game in?
Yeah, of course. I took I took I took one C++ course when I was up in Utah, and then when I transferred down here to Texas, and I took another C++ course. I took a Python course, and I took a computer graphics course where we used some Java-based scripting languages to um, basically make our own Photoshop filters. And that was it. I made uh, when I took the game design course at my first year when I transferred down here to South Texas. It was a game maker, so just whatever GML is, just really simple scripting language with a lot of documentation. And by the time I wanted to make Faith, um, I I knew that I wasn't very strong in coding, and I wanted to focus more on the graphics and the feel and the UX and stuff like that, and the horror design especially. And so I just went back into Game Maker, and eventually, uh, eventually you like they advertise Game Maker as like really easy to use and like basically drag and drop things and put in just a couple of numbers to do what you want. But if you really want to do what you want, you ditch all that and you just learn GML and you just use their scripting language, which is what I did. And yeah, so all my games are made in Game Maker 1.4. That's probably why I never get any plugs or retweets or anything from Yo-Yo Games because I refuse to get Game Maker 2, and that's probably going to change this year since I'm looking into some console ports. But yeah, just that. And then for my master's thesis, when I was in college, I used a lot of C Sharp because I was working in Unity, working in VR. And so I'm kind of a mixed bag, but I seriously lack the depth to, make my own engine or do any really in-depth stuff. I just like honestly, all I need are some audio functions, some if-then statements, and that's pretty much it. That's all that Faith is.
So with you've kind of imposed on yourself then, I suppose, some graphical and performance limitations really with the style that you've gone with Faith and the Wind. Are you looking to kind of just continue with that style and that sort of performance style, or are you looking to kind of branch out into maybe something? I don't want to say advanced because that kind of sounds like slightly condescending to what you've done now. Whereas I really love what you've done now. I think I would be happy if that's what you continue to expand upon. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Are you looking to kind of change, or are you looking to stick with this?
Well, that's a really good question. And so I have about 50 game ideas set up in a like on a spreadsheet that I have, and a lot of them could be kind of that Atari ZX Spectrum style that I incorporated into Faith. But I think I eventually do want to move on. But at the same time, it's kind of a tough decision because if I do say so myself, I'm sort of known now for my lo-fi horror games. And if I can be the ruler of a very small kingdom of chunky pixel horror games, then that would probably be satisfying. But at the same time, I've always wanted to get into 3D. I want to maybe branch out or go even more basic. You know, Faith could be interpreted as like a really good, like a kind of a okay looking DOS game, but what if I went even further down the basic graphics rabbit hole and had something, completely basic and, something at a ridiculously low resolution? And so part of me wants to go back, part of me wants to go forward. I made the Wind. The Wind looks the way it does because the client IFC Films specifically asked for an Oregon Trail looking horror game.
Right.
And I said, well, you came to the right place because that's kind of what I'm known for. And and it worked out. It really fits. I've toyed with the idea of maybe a horror game that looks like it could fit on the SNES. I've started production on a 3D horror game that is meant to seriously mimic the first Silent Hill's visual style.
Really?
And yeah, I made a bunch of assets for it, and I made a character with animation, and I was working with a big time indie horror developer, but they are currently kind of doing their own stuff that they deserve to work on, for their own career's sake, and I'm happy for them, and I wish them luck with that. But it was something that was kind of gonna work, but it kind of didn't, and it kind of fizzled out, and I might keep working on it. So yeah, I would absolutely like to branch into better graphics. It's okay to say better graphics. Faith was originally going to be. I originally envisioned Faith to run on like Unreal and have like higher fidelity graphics, like something like you would see in PT or Resident Evil or something like that, the newer ones. I really because Faith came about during the fallout after Konami canceled PT or Silent Hills, which was a dadgum shame. I'm really angry about it still. And around that time you started seeing a lot of games that I call PT where they were kind of spiritual successors. There was Allison Road, there was not Vanish, Visage or Visage, which is on Steam, and Allison Road is still in developer hell. And to an extent, Layers of Fear. A lot of people call Layers of Fear the spiritual successor to PT. I highly disagree, even though it's still an okay horror game. Uh, there's really nothing like PT, and when I first played it put a spell on me. I was absolutely obsessed with it. I would go online and look up everything that everyone ever discovered. I would help out. This one guy on YouTube was like, "Hey, I found this weird recording. It appears to be backwards," and I figured out that it was a this random audio message in the game that's backwards in Spanish. So you have to know Spanish and you have to know that it's Spanish backwards to even figure it out. And I happen to speak Spanish also, and so I interpreted it for them. I was like, this is what it means, and they're like, oh man. And then that became another fan theory about what is going on in the game and stuff. And man, the people are still obsessing and discussing PT because it was just so mysterious and so interesting. And I became obsessed with that. I was like, I want to make a game that's just like that. Like, I want to be the guy to make the spiritual successor to PT. Like, it's not super long, it's self contained, it's got enough mystery to keep people guessing. I want to make a game like that, but I don't know anything about graphics. And I don't have the time to work in one of the more high profile engines or more heavy duty 3D engines like Unity and Unreal. You can do 3D graphics in Game Maker. It's just a little difficult. You kind of have to think kind of backwards from what I've seen. And so I got this kind of idea. I was like, okay, what if I made the scariest game that I can think of? Because I played a lot of horror games, and that's mostly where my inspiration comes from, or other games that I've played and or watched others play. And I was like, but what if I did it with just super basic graphics? What if I made like a haunted Atari game? Could I still make it scary? And so I made a prototype. After a couple months, it was basically the Oregon Trail hunting mini game where you're walking around the woods, no gun, but you have your cross, and the creepy white dude, who later became Michael Davies, shows up. And if you think his audio is scary now, his original audio was this like super distorted Pokemon call from Pokemon Crystal. I think it was Murkrow, and the other one, and his retreat was Graveler, and they were like super distorted, and it was a major jump scare every time he would pop up on screen. Like I would jump, even though I was expecting him when I was developing this. And eventually, for copyright's sake, I went with the text-to-speech audio from the 70s that I eventually used some abandonware emulated text-to-speech software. And so that's kind of how it started. I really wanted to just convey good horror, but with super basic graphics. And my theory was that the horror would deliver, and it would be a unique horror experience, slightly because of the graphics, not like in spite of them. And there's a lot of irony that goes into it. Like a lot of people, and it's a lot about breaking the player's expectations, and it's a lot about uh, lulling them into some false security, and then hitting them with something really kind of startling and scary. And then you package all that up and you try to do without relying too much on jump scares, and that was kind of my challenge.
It's really interesting that your original idea was something a little bit more akin to PT, which is graphically that's beautiful, isn't it? And then
Oh, it horrified me.
yeah,
It scared the
totally.
hell out of me.
The same here, and it still does to this day. I actually, going off slightly on a tangent, but I remember when it was first released, and I'd actually just seen a clip of it, and it was that part where it's kind of like that little fetus monster thing is in the sink,
Yeah.
and that was shared everywhere, and I saw it on Facebook, and I was like, "What is this? This looks creepy as hell." And people were saying, "Oh, PT," and I had to check it out, and I was totally blown away. And then I'm actually a big Silent Hill fan myself, so when you got that reveal at the end, I have to admit I didn't find that reveal myself because I just did not have the brains to get through the whole thing. I just didn't
Oh
understand
yeah,
it.
we didn't either.
But when you
Yeah,
got
that
that
last
cutscene at
puzzle
the
is
end, oh,
yeah. That last puzzle was so impossible. We even looked online, and it was right when it came out, so there was nothing but speculation. Now I think we have a pretty good idea of how to get the phone to ring at the very end. But yeah, I first learned about it because my friends called me over and were like, "Hey, have you ever heard of PT?" I was like, "No." They're like, "It is the scariest game we've ever played. We're so scared that we can't finish it, and we need you to come over because I." Uh, I'm the guy out of all my friends that's like this obsessed with horror games, and a lot of them are scaredy cats, and so sometimes they would call me over and ask for help, and so we sat down and we played it, and it was insane. We got to the last part, but we didn't know how to how to finish it, but and then they would replay it and get all kinds of weird things to happen, like changing the flashlight color and Lisa popping up in places where she shouldn't have, and like weird glitches and stuff, and it was very, very interesting. I will never forgive Konami for canceling it. Um, but but yeah, it's a huge inspiration for Faith. I wanted something that was mysterious, something that would instill dread, but also deliver some good scares, and that had a lore that was accessible and discoverable if you really wanted to look for it, but didn't tell you everything at once.
yeah, I totally agree with you. I really do. Do you think that maybe it's well? First off, I've got to say I'm glad that you didn't go down the road of creating these PT-esque games because, like you, I played Layers of Fear and I really enjoyed it for what it was worth. Me and a group of friends actually got together and we all played through it together, so it was really enjoyable in that sense. And I thought it was a good game. And I think it kind of got to a point where a lot of video games, if it was first person and it was set in a house, it was PT.
Hmm.
And I think quite a lot of games were probably unfairly labeled with that. Not that it's a bad label at all, because that's a huge compliment, I think. but there was definitely that wave of those games coming out. And I'm really glad that what you decided to go off and create was totally different to anything else that I've seen anyway, especially in the past 5 years to 10 years. So yeah, I have to say I'm really glad that you kind of went off and took your own path with that.
Well, I was a little nervous when I first released it that it would get compared to the mini games in Five Nights at Freddy's, especially the second one,
Right.
where it kind of goes into the I don't know the lore. I don't pretend to know the lore for FNAF, but where it kind of goes into the minds of the animatronics, and so it turns into like an MS-DOS or Atari game. And I wanted something that was even clunkier than that, and some and so every once in a while I get compared to it. I think when Markiplier played The Wind, he made a comment that it reminded me of the FNAF mini games, and um, I don't really want to be compared to FNAF, um, but that's one thing. That's when I made when Faith landed on IGN's list of best horror games of 2017, the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza or whatever incarnation of FNAF had come out that year was also included on that list, and so I was like, well, I guess I wasn't the most retrograde, but yeah, I want to keep doing Faith as long as I can. I'm currently like actually this is something nobody knows, so hashtag exclusive on your podcast. I'm actually going to start production on Chapter 3 on Monday, and
Really?
maybe even maybe even with the help of a publisher. I'm still working on that. So I want to keep doing that, and I want to kind of maybe do a couple more games or spin-offs in the Faith universe, but then move on. But yeah, I'm very satisfied with how it's come out. I really enjoyed Chapter 2. Chapter 2 was a huge struggle, and when I finished it, I was really nervous about it because I was kind of doubting myself the whole time while I was developing it because sequelitis and all. And I wanted to make something that was just as scary, but a little different, but not too different. And uh, I was worried about the paywall, if people were gonna be willing to pay a dollar or whatever the equivalent was, and for it. And so far, pretty, it's been pretty good, and I really enjoyed the support and the feedback that I've gotten from players, and I'm really satisfied with how it went. And so, with Chapter 3, I'm gonna have to blow it all out of the water and make something that everyone's gonna just go crazy over. But I'm I'm gonna try my hardest to make it the scariest dang game I can possibly make, and we'll see about that.
You say that you were a little bit worried about Faith 2 in particular and releasing that. And to me, when I played through Faith 2, well, I played through Faith and I was blown away. I loved it. I played through Faith 2 and I was really, really blown away by that because the style, again, talking about the limitations that you put on yourself, but it seemed like you had so much more confidence with what you could do in Faith 2. So Faith 1 was still super original, but then Faith 2, you were doing these things that I was like, you could just tell that you had really, really expanded upon everything that you learned from Faith 1, and you were really getting to grips. You were getting really adept with everything that you could do. So it does strike me as interesting that you're a little bit probably more worried about Faith 2 than Faith 1. I'm not sure if you were more worried about Faith 2 than you were Faith 1, but that's kind of the vibe that I just got from you.
Yeah, and without going into well, we can go into spoiler territory if you want. I'm assuming people have played both games if they want to listen. But the big twist at the end of Chapter 2, I knew I wanted to do it early on, and so that 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 type of twist at the end can kind of make people roll their eyes, especially with like movies and games and stuff, especially horror games. And so I wanted to do it in a way that was still scary, and I wanted to do it in a way that wasn't cheesy. And I don't know if I succeeded or not, or what, but um, one person got really angry about it. I well, not really angry. I just got this. I got a direct message on Twitter by a player, and they said, you know what? I just gosh, I feel like chapter two was just so disjointed and it just didn't have any logic to it. And then the twist at the end, it just didn't make any sense and stuff. And so it's not for everyone, but a lot of people did like it. When I watched, if you don't watch a really entertaining playthrough of chapter two, watch the Scary Game Squad with Jesse Cox and them playing it, and they did. Uh, they really enjoyed it, and they were really getting scared towards the end, and and stuff. And they kind of pieced together a lot of the story themselves, and I was impressed with how close they got to what I had originally envisioned and that was going on and stuff. But yeah, I wanted chapter two to be different. It's I took a different approach when gathering inspiration and reference for it. I watched different movies to prepare for it. I played different games to prepare for it. I read different books. Chapter 2 has a lot of Lovecraft in it, a lot. I basically read an entire volume of Lovecraft's short stories to prep for Chapter 2, and I think it shows. And yeah, there's definitely this Lovecraftian part to it, and um, I also kind of structured it differently, whereas it's a little more linear, but it's got replay value because you can go back and play it for different endings. And I was really worried about the linearity. I was afraid that people wouldn't understand what I was trying to accomplish, and I think a lot of people don't really fully understand. They're just kind of drinking the Kool-Aid anyway. Um, but I really just wanted it to be this. Well, it says so on the game page. John descends into a new nightmare, and so chapter two is all about his guilt that he feels about the previous game and how he's dealing with it. And you learn from his experiences after the original exorcism, the original exorcism in 1986, and other experiences that he's struggling internally with a lot of things, and that struggle is manifest in the game. And so the game is partly what he's afraid of, but also partly what he wishes the world was like so that he could fix things. And I think we all kind of feel it that way. Um, I think sometimes when we feel like things aren't going right or something is not right with us, we try to invent a world where it all makes sense. Like there's a monster that we have to slay, or there's a thing we have to fix, or there is a demon tucked away deep inside a sewer tunnel that if we can just defeat it, we can get rid of what's happening. But instead, the conflict is more within ourselves, and so I tried to kind of make it something like that. And it doesn't mean that parts of the game aren't given the twist and the doubt that anything you experience in the second game is actually real. There are things that are real. It's just if I want to wax philosophical for a second, like what is real? Is sometimes reality is just a window or it's just a picture that our mind paints, and so I tried to make it a little more complex than just your typical twist ending of that sort. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. I didn't enjoy making it sometimes. It was very tedious, and there's a lot of optimization problems. I have to go back and redo a lot of the texture work or a lot of the texture pages because people with crappy like integrated graphics cards just can't run the second game, which I'm really ashamed of. They're supposed to be super accessible, to anyone, and so yeah, I'm really satisfied with chapter two.
You're talking about you were playing different games, reading books, watching movies and things. I think that's something that a lot of people overlook in a lot of games, and that's the writing itself. Can you
Mm.
explain your writing process? I mean, would you classify yourself as a writer? Do you have an interest in writing, or is it more you wanted and needed to write because you wanted to create a game?
I hate writing. I hate story and I hate storytelling because I'm bad at it. I'm really bad. If you ask me to tell a story, I'm just going to ramble like I've been doing for the past 30 minutes. And so I knew that I didn't wasn't a strong storyteller, so I purposefully made the story fragmented and mysterious. So there's a lot of holes, there's a lot of red herrings, there's a lot of red herrings. Um, just because the Vatican says that John was not a an ordained minister doesn't mean that that's the truth. But so it kind of worked to my advantage, but it was kind of born out of my own weakness in storytelling. And so Faith the original Faith, I took a lot from just your basic exorcism gone wrong story from Hollywood. So before I started Faith, I watched The Exorcist. I watched The Last Exorcism, which is very highly underrated.
Yeah,
I
I
watched
totally
Paranormal.
agree with you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I watched Paranormal Activity 3, which is one of my guilty pleasure all-time favorite horror movies. I watched. Oh, it's really good. It's practically a standalone movie. You don't really need to watch any of the other ones, especially two. Two is just worthless. But yeah. So Paranormal Activity 3, The Right with Anthony Hopkins, and I think that was it. And then the rest was just a lot of horror tropes from Resident Evil. I say tropes, but it's actually just really good game design. I played the HD remake of Resident Evil 1 several times during the course of making Faith and Chapter 2. And so, with kind of armed with that knowledge and kind of that Hollywood interpretation of your kind of Catholic version of exorcism, I just went to work, and luckily the game is pretty well received as this like hour-long exorcism. Like you're tracking down someone who is possessed, and you finally corner them and have this big showdown. I don't think that, and that's a, I don't think that overarching suspense was there as much in Chapter 2. Chapter 2 was more like a collection of short horror stories kind of strung together in a game with an overarching theme. And so I don't really think one structure is better than the other. But for Chapter 2, I played Fatal Frame 2, which is one of my all-time favorite horror games. I played Shadow Man, which is another one of my favorite games. Played uh, Resident Evil HD Remake again. And I read a lot of Lovecraft. And then I kind of just got down into it. And then if I see a good horror game or horror movie, I'll take a break during dev time and play it or watch it just to kind of stay fresh. But yeah, I'm really weak at writing, so it's more like hinting at and implying at things that are happening rather than. And then most of the time, the player just figures out the story for themselves, or they interpret it the way they want. And a lot of things in Faith aren't meant to be taken just one certain way. They can be interpreted in many ways to kind of fit the views of the player.
I would argue what you've done though is very good writing because you're not spoon feeding things to everyone. There is plenty of content. I know content's a filthy word now, but in this context, there's plenty of content there that people can really root around and then start putting the dots together for themselves. And I would say personally, that's good writing because you're not pandering to people. You're not kind of treating people as if they're children. You know, you're treating the players as adults, and you're giving them things, and you're saying there's little clues here. You've got to go and search for it yourself and figure it out. And if you get something from that, great. And if you don't get something from that, then that's absolutely fine. And I think that's a superior way of writing, in particular with horror games.
Yeah, there has to be this fear of the unknown and this element of mystery about it.
Yeah.
You can't just have a scientist in a lab coat show up at the very end and be like, well, what happened was the monster was actually a protoplasm that was angry because we're destroying the environment or something like that. I think that was like the plot of Poltergeist 3. And I recently I recently finished this game called Remothered, Tormented Fathers, which is a weird ass name for a horror game. And it sported really good graphics, and the main protagonist was like a middle-aged woman that was not sexy. And I was like, I want to play that game because like
Mhm.
we got too many horror games that are just the same protagonists. And and PS2 had that era of cute squirrel girls with dog companions. Like there were like 5 games that had that. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I just really was interested in playing a game without like a super appealing main character.
Mhm.
And I liked it until the very end where these two characters like fall out of a window off out of like a three-story building and they crash to the ground and they're laying on the ground and they basically give away the entire story in like 2 minutes of dialogue. They're like, you were blah 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 and you did this because of this and this virus was actually making you do this, but then you did this and I am actually this. I was like, this is not the kind of things that people are gonna say when they're dying. Like, and I was really disappointed that it just seemed so unnatural, and the voice acting was good. It's just they had these lines that were just so cheesy, and they just gave away the entire story. And I was really disappointed in the ending. The rest of the game was okay, but um, yeah, you should never treat your audience like they're not intelligent. You should give them time and space to kind of figure things out. And I love horror stories that can be interpreted multiple ways, like, were they crazy or was it actually this? The Wind being a good example of that. And yeah, so I'm happy to hear that people enjoyed the story. A lot of people, when I look at like YouTube comments and feedback on Itch.io and stuff, I see a lot of that they like the story. I'm like, okay, I guess I guess a little story is the best story in some aspects. So I'm gonna keep with that formula. I have some pretty fun stuff in store story wise for chapter 3, but a lot of it just kind of happens organically while I'm working on something, and I'll be like, oh yeah, I can do that. And so I'm sorry to say I don't have everything planned out already. It's very much organic and kind of happening as I go along, but uh,
I
I
think
think
that
people will
works.
be.
Yeah, I think
I
you're
think
definitely getting something from it.
Yeah, I think chapter 3 will be a good conclusion. I hope. I think it'll be.
I'm very excited for it. Going on a slight tangent, I must say you're probably one of maybe 3 people that have said to me that they've played Shadow Man. Like that is a game that
I
not a lot of people have
love
played.
Shadow Man.
It's brilliant.
The Dark Souls before there was Dark Souls.
Oh, I totally agree.
I It's just so brilliant. It's like I was such a edgy little goth kid in high school, and I loved this game because it was like rivers of blood, spikes everywhere, serial killers who are actually demons, and and the main character Mike Leroy is such a riot. Like, he has the best one-liners. He opens up one of the coffin gates and he goes, "I am the Lord of Deadside," and I'm like, I want to be that guy. And it's awesome, and that was made by Acclaim, or was it published by Acclaim? I don't know. I think it was made by Acclaim because the levels are so gigantic and massive. They remind me of Turok levels, which are giant and massive and easy to get lost in. And so, um, yeah, I played the N64 version originally, and then I have the PC version on Steam, and uh, it's so good. Like, everything just has a like, hardly anyone does that voodoo aesthetic or that voodoo like visual style and design style, and it's just so cool. But anyway, yeah, I really enjoy Shadow Man. There's a lot of parts I hated about it, but there's a lot of good design parts um, that I try to kind of keep in mind and incorporate.
And
I
if
love the
memory
feeling
serves
of
me
going.
well, I'm pretty sure it kind of correlates slightly to Faith because the intro to Shadow Man, when you're getting that narration from Jack the Ripper in the sewers of London, it has
Moonlight Sonata.
yes.
That was absolutely in there because of that, and also from
Was
Resident
it
Evil
really?
1. Yeah,
Wow.
so it's a com. Yeah, I knew I wanted to have. Well, for one, it's like the spookiest sounding royalty-free classical song that I could find.
Yeah.
And there's a Hector Berlioz in Faith Chapter 1 and 2 also. And but yeah, Moonlight Sonata, I knew I wanted to put in there because it was just a creepy tune that I remember from Resident Evil and Shadow Man. Like, specifically, I wanted to pay an homage to that. Yeah, so you're spot on. That's absolutely from Shadow Man.
Oh, great. So, what was the main driving force behind creating Faith for you?
I wanted to enter the indie games scene, and I wanted to enter the indie horror game scene. At the time I made Faith, PT had resurrected my hope in the horror genre. I'd played a little bit of The Evil Within. I thought The Evil Within, Chapter 2 takes a lot from Evil Within structure, how it's basically this giant haunted house that you're walking through. And but I didn't necessarily like the first Evil Within or the second one. It's just like combat and like combo upgrades in like a horror game. But um, and then at the same time, FNAF happened, and Markiplier had played FNAF 2, which kind of skyrocketed the whole franchise and made it super popular. The guy from Game Theory made like 20 videos on FNAF, and I really like the first and second games. The fourth one's okay, and then I stopped. I lost interest in the sister location, I believe it was, and then the fan bases. Uh, crazy fan bases can very large fan bases can quickly become really annoying.
Yeah.
Um, but I do enjoy FNAF. I just thought that it became FNAF. It went from becoming an original scary horror game to a game based on a relationship between Scott Cawthon and his fans, and it was really interesting. It was like all the FNAF games were like that came after three were the brainchild of the developer and the fans. And I'm fine with fan feedback. I just felt like it wasn't it kind of lost its original charm. But around that time, everyone wanted to do FNAF stuff, and everybody wanted to make FNAF clones. And then you still had your kind of cookie cutter zombie survival games on Steam Greenlight, later to be just Steam, and all over the place. And then your typical walking simulator, flashlight walking simulators with like that has like the twist at the end where you walk down a hall and it's just a dead end. Then you turn around, and it's a closer dead end. Then you turn around, it's an even closer dead end. Then you turn around, the monster's there, and that's it. Um, you've played like 50 games like that, and and I wanted to do something different. And I could. When it comes to creativity, it's like something that it's like a volcano inside of me. It's like something that boils up inside of me until it just kind of erupts, and I have to express it somehow. And so um, I just got on my computer and I started up Game Maker, and it took me a couple of weeks to really get the hang of the controls and how I wanted to do things. And I just arbitrarily chose a resolution, which later turned out to not be in my favor. It's very very unconventional resolution and aspect ratio, but I guess I guess I made it work. And I just went for it, and um, I had very little QA testing or any kind of feedback from my peers. I showed it to who I call my inner circle, who are just my close friends who are all game designers and QA managers and have worked in the industry. And I would just show it to them, and I do a big release party, if you will, when I'm finally ready. Well, I would say a week before I release each game, whether it's the demo or a full game. I'll have my inner circle over, as many of them as can make it, and we'll just play through the game, for a couple hours at night. And usually it's the first time anyone besides me has seen the game, and that's kind of my process. And regretfully, I don't have the funds or the resources to really roll out some good QA. So a lot of times when I release a game, I'll instantly get like 50 emails of like, "Hey, this isn't working." I'll be like, "Crap, I forgot to do this." So I'll roll out an update, and that's really not a good way to release a game. But people who've played Faith and the fan base, I guess you could call them, still kind of weird saying that the game has a fan base, but uh, they're usually really patient. And itch.io is such that if you purchase the game once, you get access to all the subsequent updates. And so yeah, it worked out. It really just came down to being obsessed with horror games and wanting to make my own, and seeing that like really a lot of it just comes back to PT, just something that was like short, digestible in maybe one sitting, maybe two, self-contained, um, but still interesting and very scary. And that was my whole design philosophy.
hmm And going back to something that you said a little bit earlier, are you trying to And obviously, you read the comments. You're saying you read the comments on YouTube, and you get Twitter DMs and things like that. But are you actively trying to kind of separate yourself from your fan base in order to make sure that the games that you create are entirely your own, and you're not kind of having outside influence that maybe doesn't belong there?
Well, thankfully, the fan base for Faith has been very supportive, and I've only gotten one or two messages being like, "Hey, you know what you should do in your next game?" Like nothing is more irritating than telling a dev how to make their game.
I bet.
And I try to be as nice as possible to them, and just say, "Hey, thanks for your feedback." And but I don't try to. I'm really not of the mind of separating myself from my fan base. I made a big deal of this a couple of years ago after it was some tragedy that happened because of uh, somebody who played some. It was a gamer who was troubled, I'm sure, and then was kind of an outcast and kind of ignored by everyone else, and then they ended up doing something very terrible. And I sent a message out saying, "Hey, my DMs are always open if you want to talk." And a couple people actually took me up on that, but that's kind of the policy that I'm going to have for a while, as long as I can manage it. If I keep getting junk and like hate mail and stuff, which I don't have any hate mail, but if I get like spam and stuff, then I might think otherwise. But I try to be very accessible as a developer, especially since I don't have any QA people. So I depend on people to message me and say, "Hey, I found this glitch," and most of the time I will fix it and let them know about an update. So I'm gonna try to be as close to my fan base as possible. So far, their speculation and their discussion on the story of Faith and what it all means has been very positive for me as a developer, and it has given me some good ideas, but it hasn't really dictated any major points for the game. So I feel comfortable being close to uh, the fan base for the games. As far as distancing myself, uh, mostly I just think it's understood that you just need to respect the creative liberty of the developer, and just, you know, if you like games that someone comes out with, like, just trust that they'll make continue to make good stuff for you. Just be open. But yeah, I try to be pretty close to them.
Good. Um, Going back to the style that you've chosen for the Faith series, did you have any ideas or any things that you wanted to explore or put into the game, but you couldn't because of the limitations of the graphics and the play style?
I wanted to have a first-person sequence in chapter two. Chapter two was going to be very different, but it eventually got to be too big, and I'm saving a lot of that stuff for chapter three. But there was a lot of cut content, but it was mostly because of time's sake, and because I needed to finish it. Like, it was well done, and I was about to burn it, and so I kind of put the plug and shelved on. I kind of shelved a lot of stuff that ended up being cut from chapter two. Chapter two was going to be massive, but it's already twice as big as Faith, so I decided just to make it work with what I had. But as far as the limitations go, I really wanted to get this perfect balance of a game with like its in-game universe and how the game kind of reaches out to you, the player. And I've played a lot of horror games that kind of mess with you. I remember I'm Scared was this really good indie horror game that would actually put files in a folder on your desktop, and a window would pop up and show you these files, and it was like the game was haunting your computer. And I wanted to make a game that was like it could be like a cursed video game that people talk about, but the game itself doesn't reach out to the player, through the game all that much. And so I kind of wanted to do stuff like have like human voices talking to the player at certain parts. I thought about a first person sequence just to really screw with the player and like kind of throw them for a loop. But in the end, I had to kind of stick thematically with my visual design, because that was where the game derived a lot of its strength.
How do you create the cutscenes? They're so elaborate, and but at the same time, they really stick within the theme and the same graphical style. How do you create those? The animations are so smooth. They're so nice.
They are all acted by myself.
I had an inkling.
And
Are you doing like a
I'm
take on me, aha, type thing?
absolutely, so it's exactly that. It's rotoscoped animation, just not as cool as Take on Me, but um, I gotta go back and watch that. So yeah, I don't know how I got the idea. I think I just really liked shows like SpongeBob and Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack, where every once in a while they would do this extreme close up of something that looked very real and was very unsettling to look at. And I kind of wanted to do that. I wanted to be like, okay, um, what if you kind of dipped into that uncanny valley and we're like, it looks like I'm looking at something that's human, but it's not, and it shouldn't be, because there's a demon hand coming out of its face. And so I just filmed them all myself. That's why Amy Martin has such broad, strong shoulders and stuff. And so yeah, I think it started with Michael. Michael has a special cutscene if you pause the game when he's on screen, and you get a kind of a special treat with the rotoscope cutscene for him. That's all from motion capture. I happen to be a 3D animator. That's what I went to school for, and I'm kind of proficient in setting up motion capture and stuff. And so I just traced over that. And yeah, it is frame by frame. It's 15 frames per second, which uh, eases the burden on me. Whenever I make one of these, I always want to prolong them, but they always end up being really short, like 5, 6 seconds at at the most, because I have to hand draw every single frame. And they're very messy. They're not very neat. And Richard Williams, who was the animator for Thief and the Cobbler and Who Framed Roger Rabbit, he had this theory called the persistence of vision, which is basically the after image effect, that you can watch something that's at 15 frames per second, 10 frames per second, 7 or 8 frames per second, and you can perceive motion um, as if your mind was interpolating the keyframes for you. And so I get a lot of comments that the animation is so smooth, but it's literally the same frame rate as the rest of the game, still 15 frames per second. It's just your mind and your eyes and that persistence of vision principle is kind of blurring the frames together for you. And that really works in the game's advantage because they're very unsettling, very cool moments. I love every single one of them, but every single one of them takes like a whole day to make because I'm sitting there tracing over the footage, and I have a tablet that I can use with a little stylus pen, but it's um it's like a peripheral one. It's not one where you actually draw on the screen, so it's still kind of unwieldy. But yeah, I really enjoy them. That's how I make them. And if uh, any of your listeners, or for those who have a GDC Vault Pass, you can watch my talk that I gave at GDC in March, where I showed the reference footage, the live action footage. And that reminds me, I need to post it on Twitter. It's probably time that those go out into the world
Yeah,
to
please do.
ruin
I'd love to
people's
see
lives
those.
because they're really funny. Like one of them has me like basically in an apron and a blanket over my head, and that's how I did one of the rotoscope scenes for Miriam Bell, Sister Bell. And I just use a lot of layering. I use Photoshop, so there's a paywall for that. But honestly, you could probably do the same thing in GIMP or uh, some open source software.
Mhm.
But yeah, I use a lot of layering, and then some of them that are really crazy, I actually blend between the rotoscoped animation and just hand drawn animation that I do myself, and um, those are always kind of cool because you can never tell if what you're looking at is quote unquote real or not, you know.
Yeah, I was going to say, I doubt that you had an actual hand coming through your face at one point for that.
Yeah, I basically had to do the posing. I basically had to act for Amy as the hand was coming out, and then I basically had to do the same thing with my hand, and then frame by frame, I had to reposition the hand to fit onto my face, and then I traced over that. So yeah, some of them got a little complicated, and it's all just brute force stuff. I don't have any like algorithms or any like special like machine learning that does it for me and stuff, but it's just pure old-fashioned handcrafted animation.
You're kind of a one man army, really, aren't you? Because obviously you've done the writing, you've done the developing, you've done the art, and I believe you've done the music as well. And I think a lot of the music that you do is very somber. I know, obviously, you've got, um, oh my god, Moonlight Sonata in there and things like that. But I'm assuming that you create all of the music yourself. How is that process for you?
Yeah, I use chiptone, and I will. It's got a little note selection function. I'm not I'm not totally inept at music. I'm probably a worse composer than I am a storyteller, but I can make freaky sounding ambient tracks, and I know the basis of keys and scales and what notes sound good together and when to make them not sound good together for a certain effect. Uh, Gearing up for the music for Faith Chapter 2, I watched a lot of music theory for the Legend of Zelda series. That the music has kind of its own flavor, and you can instantly recognize a Zelda tune because it uses certain patterns and certain structures to convey a sense of adventure. And so I used a little bit of music theory from A Link to the Past, and I used a little bit of music theory from Majora's Mask, but I'm a I'm not very skilled when it comes to music. So my process was to go into Chiptone, which is a free um, online uh, like chiptone sound effects machine, and it's got the little keyboard in it, so I could select a note that I wanted. And once I found something that was sufficiently scary sounding or kind of cool sounding, I would save that as like a note, and then I would bring those notes into Audacity and do my layering and my mixing and stuff. And then I would see how it went in game, and everything that I didn't compose myself was royalty free or or like fair use MIDI files that I ran through a like a chipset interpreter, and so it sounded like it belonged on like the Famicom or the NES or some sort of MS-DOS application. And so I'm really careful to get all my licensing in order and make sure that like it's fair use and or whatever license I can use for commercial reasons and that's what I use there. Um, I like to take shortcuts when it comes to audio and sound and stuff, but yeah, so I did get into a little bit of composing, and then I made a basically made an original song for Faith One during one of the endings. If you leave the if you you'll get to the letter at the end of the ending. If you leave it there for more than a minute, you'll get a track that's not uh, it's not 8-bit or chip tune or anything. It's just a regular song. Um, it's got Enochian chanting that I had to look up Enochian uh, myself, and it has actual lyrics and stuff, and um, it's kind of a tribal, creepy, occult sounding song. And it's also on the soundtrack on YouTube. You can listen to it at the very end. And
Wow,
so,
sorry, I was just going to say I never actually discovered that in games, so I'm going to go back and have a listen to that.
yeah, get I believe it's called The Offering. Get the ending where you mess with the dead fox in the woods. That is a blatant nod to Antichrist. That one movie with Willem Dafoe where he gets his balls smashed by a sledgehammer. Um, so yeah, so I literally put a moment from that movie in the game just because it was really cool and sort of obscure. And so yeah, once you get that ending, you'll see the ending with the red text from Gary. And if you leave it on that screen for a minute, you'll and turn the volume up a little bit, you'll get a bonus track.
Interesting. Like Shadow Man, you're probably one of maybe three people that have also seen the film Antichrist.
Sometimes I regret that I did, but it's very interesting.
Yeah, interesting is the word, definitely. Some great cinematography.
Yeah, absolutely. The ending is spectacular too. It's very surreal, very cool.
Yeah, yeah. And some parts that really do make you want to look away.
Yeah. I yeah, the music I always get a little worried about music, and if I ever get into like 3D games or games that kind of get out of that 8-bit era, then I'm going to be in trouble, or I'm going to have to hire a composer or something because I don't know anything about composing music. Um, so I originally Faith was going to have a lot of 80s songs because it's set in 1987. And in fact, if you want a good idea of if you want to hear the one song that that I could say Faith is pretty much based off of would be Twilight Zone by Golden Earring. You give that song a listen. It's one of my favorite 80s songs because it's got this amazing solo in the middle of it. Um, but if you listen to the lyrics to that song, a lot of that, in fact, there are some lyrics from that song that are directly put into Chapter 2. Um, but yeah, that the kind of vibe of that song is kind of what I wanted to do. And yeah, I found some MIDI files of some 80 songs, and I was going to convert them to chiptune and put them in the game, but I really didn't want record labels coming after me and shutting me down for that. So
I think you make a smart move.
yeah, I went with kind of royalty-free open source stuff.
Talking about, obviously, you said if you go into maybe a better graphical game, that you'll possibly have to look at someone else doing the music. Have you ever considered, or are you considering, or would you consider expanding Airdorf games into a team or collaborating with others on a game, or would you just?
Oh, that's a really good question. It's something that I thought of for a long time. So as I said earlier, I was working on a collab with a really cool horror developer who I really wanted to work with. I don't think it's going to happen because we're both kind of moving on to kind of our own things. I'm not close to collaboration, but I have a few concerns with it. So number one, I don't I do not make nearly as much money as I think the games deserve. um, I make enough money for a I used to make enough money for a cheap date night every week. Now I make enough money off of Faith and Faith Chapter 2 for a nicer date night every week. And eventually at the end of the year, we have enough saved for like a pretty decent vacation, which is more than a lot of developers can say, but I do not nearly make enough capital to be able to put anyone on payroll. And I've had friends who are like, "Man, just say the word, and like we will work at Airdorf Games, and we can work together, and we can all do this remotely and stuff." And I tell them like, "Man, I really want to, but I like in my mind I do not want to put anyone through a situation where they are working on a project and not getting fairly compensated for it." I have to be one of those people who believe in the business side of games very much. Like there's a lot of scummy stuff that happens in the games industry, but I very much want to entertain, but I also very much want to be compensated for my time and effort. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to make any more games. And so I have a day job while apart from Airdorf. It would be my absolute dream to work on Airdorf full time and be able to sustain myself that way, but like I'm a family man. I have a wife, I have a family, and we have a home, and there's bills. And so I have to be realistic about the expectations I have for funding. Now, if there was a publisher that had funding for me um, that would kind of take the edge off of the financial burden of working on my games full time, so that I could put more stuff out there and better stuff out there, um, I would agree to that. But unless someone was completely crazy and said, "I will work for you for free and I do not care what happens to me," and I trust that person and I work really well with that person and I like that person's work and they kind of match me creatively, then yes, I am open to collabing or having a team. But For now, Airdorf is just one person. I do get a lot of good feedback from my inner circle. Um,
Hmm.
I can always come to them for advice and stuff and ideas. There were times when I was really discouraged and kind of doubting myself, and that's when I would kind of stop and show the game to my wife, who hates games and is probably totally freaked out by like how obsessive I am with horror games and like scaring people, but she's very very supportive. And I show it to my inner circle, and I get design advice from them and art advice and stuff, and they're very good at kind of talking me off of ledges and keeping me in the right frame of mind. So I do depend on them, but unfortunately, I can't pay anybody but myself right now, and I would never expect anyone to dedicate months or years of their life to work at a studio where they're not supported, um, no matter how into it they are. That's just kind of my philosophy. I've read about um, places like co-ops that they have in mostly in Canada, a few in Europe and stuff where they like don't believe in money, and I'm just like I'm just blown away. It just doesn't compute to me. Um,
Yeah.
so
I find it so interesting how someone who sort of grew up in a household that maybe weren't too interested or supportive of video games and uh,
that's putting it lightly. One one time, my dad got really mad at me and told me that video games and pornography are the same thing,
oh really?
and so I yeah, so I have a Christian upbringing, so I obviously I stay away from pornography. So that was like a harsh blow. And from that point on, I basically had to play games like in the middle of the night, like for a while. And yeah, it was really weird. I love my parents, and I never had a problem with them, but um, I think it was rough on my dad. My dad never really liked games, I guess. Actually, he really liked games that had fishing in it. So I bet if I made a game that had like a fishing mini game in it, he would really like it. And I remember one time I was working on Zelda Classic, and I just released a game, and I put it online, and they have a great database that has like ratings and screenshots and its own game page and stuff, and a little discussion board dedicated to each quest and stuff. It's real friendly towards the developers, and I was checking my stats and stuff and doing some community management, and I was maybe 17, and my dad I heard my dad in the background behind me on the couch. He was like, "Hey, still working on that stupid game?" And I love my dad a lot. I did not hate him, but I got really mad, so I whipped around and I was like, "All right, this is a game that I've been working on for a year. I release it online to like millions of people, and they really like it. It has a 4 out of 5 heart container rating on ZeldaClassic.com, and it made like screenshot of the week, and it I felt really bad afterwards because it was kind of it was kind of a shock to hear that. Um, and and from that point on he was a little more supportive, but yeah, I kind of had to butt heads with my parents, and of course growing up, my parents knew the perfect way to punish me, which was to take away my Game Boy or take away my N64, and they could control anything I did with that. And I'm not bad mouthing my parents, like I love them absolutely, but the whole games thing was really rough. And unfortunately, my dad passed away before I created Faith, and so a lot of times I wonder what he would think of me now and what he would think about all this now. I'm sure he would be very interested in the business side, and he'd be very interested in kind of the industry side of making games. And he was always very supportive of my other creative endeavors like animation and art and drawing. It was just games for some reason. He never really caught on to it, and so I wish I could say that I was one of those kids who like had a huge interest in it, and their parents bought me an old crappy computer and told me to learn how to program, and then and then I eventually became John Romero. I wish I could say that, but you just can't dwell on that. Um, I would like to think that he would be proud of me if he saw the games.
Hmm.
He hated horror movies though. You absolutely could not get him to watch any horror movies, and so I don't know how he would feel about the subject matter, but uh, I think he'd be proud of the writing. I think he'd be proud of the fact that I wanted to make a game that I'm a developer who has lived a life of faith and worship, but at the same time, I really didn't want faith to be preachy. I wanted it to be interpreted in any way that people wanted to. And I talked about this on another podcast. Is that I'm open to criticisms of religion, and I'm not Catholic, and so it kind of worked out that faith is about uh, this kind of creative side of the Hollywood's interpretation of exorcism,
Hmm.
and I've gotten good responses. I've gotten really interesting responses. I've gotten people who have messaged me and said, "Hey, as an atheist, I just am really impressed with faith. Like, I haven't seen such a poignant, criticism of modern religion in a long time, and you managed to make a game about religion that wasn't annoying. And just as someone who is not a believer, I just want to give you the thumbs up for making such a cool game." And then I'll get messages from people who like, "Hey, I'm a devout Catholic, and I just want to say thank you for making faith. Like it really, it 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 talks a lot about being faithful and righteousness triumphing over evil and the power of God and stuff." And I'm like, y'all are both wrong. Like I really didn't want the game to be. I didn't want the game to be either. I didn't want the game to be anti-religion, but I didn't want it to be super pro-religion.
Hmm.
And I think the game, like we talked about earlier, I think the writing in the game allows people of of whatever ideology to enjoy the game and interpret it how they want.
Yeah, certainly, and you've had examples from that as well, as you've just mentioned. So there's definite proof there that people are taking from it what they can and what they will, and rather than you sort of forcing it down people's throats. And I think if members of your family could experience that, I think they would probably have the same feelings as well as the people that have different beliefs that are playing your games.
Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes I wonder what my dad would say if he saw that I got into games and like really got into games and wasn't working in the AAA industry, but rather kind of doing my own thing on the indie side. I think he'd be interested and I think he'd be supportive, but yeah, it was rough for a while. And but yeah, you can't tear me away from it, man. I love games. I think about them constantly, and as someone with ADD, like games are kind of therapeutic. They're an interesting escape, and they're a cool way to kind of turn your brain off when you're thinking too much.
Yeah.
And it's kind of I play a lot of games. I play a lot of horror games, but I play a lot of non-horror games. You got to be well-rounded. I recently started playing Monster Hunter World, and now I've fallen so far deep the rabbit hole because there's just so much freaking content in that game. Um, but I'm really enjoying it, and it's a good way to kind of reset psychologically. But when I really get into creative mode for the games that I make, I'll kind of get into this deep dive of like horror games and horror movies and stuff, and it's hard to keep up, especially when I'm trying to be inspired by something and stuff. So sometimes you do have to put the brakes on it and be like, okay, no more horror games this week. I'm starting to
Yeah.
get really depressed. But
Yeah. Going back to
what's
something.
funny?
Sorry, no, carry on.
I just want to make a quick comment. On the kind of the psychological side of horror games, I've heard a lot of people say that they think that horror and experiencing horror is therapeutic for them, that it helps them kind of face their own darkness in their life. And I see that a lot come up on horror let's players on YouTube. It's somehow very helpful to people psychologically to either play horror games or watch someone uh, play one because it's like they're experiencing it with them and they're kind of coming out as okay at the end of it. And I've gotten a little bit of feedback in that aspect for Faith. But anyway, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
No, no, please do. I was just. It was not really a question where I was going, but it was more of a, I guess, an analysis maybe. But when you were saying that, you kind of, there is a part of you that maybe wishes that you could have got a PC at a younger stage and started programming, learning code, doing this, and so on and so forth. I think the way that you've had it worked for you for definite, because maybe if you had access to all of that at a younger age, maybe you wouldn't be creating the games that you do that you're creating now. Maybe you wouldn't even be creating games. Maybe that resistance there is what's really pushed you to, no, I want to do this. I want to learn how to do this, and I want to create my own things. Because I think a lot of aspirations for creative people and the want to do things tend to come from some form of resistance in their lives. So maybe it's a benefit that you had that in place.
Yeah, I wonder if I sat down with a psychologist or something and really talked about my childhood and stuff, if a lot of the inspiration to make games came from my childhood. It wasn't that I had like a super restrictive upbringing. It's just like we had standards growing up. There were certain shows I wasn't allowed to watch, and certain movies I wasn't allowed to watch, and certain games I wasn't allowed to play. I quote unquote borrowed, but I actually ended up indefinitely borrowing and never returning a Nintendo Entertainment System from a friend of mine. It's all right. He didn't miss it. He already got into the next gen consoles. I just wanted to play retro games, and he gave me a crap ton of games to play, and my parents uh, took the games. This was before the internet, and just judging by the box art, they told me what I could and couldn't play. And the games that didn't make the cut were Ninja Gaiden for the NES and Mike Tyson's Punch Out for the NES. They put them up on top of the entertainment center where our TV was, where I couldn't reach, and there they sat for several years until I got tall enough and bold enough to get up on a chair and get it myself and play Mike Tyson's Punch Out. And it's so cartoony and non-violent that it's just fine. I think my parents had something against boxing. It is what it was. And then Ninja Gaiden is like super fun. It's kind of cartoony in itself. There's no blood. There's no blood in any NES games and stuff. But so yeah, a lot of it was and um, like I have to say, like growing up, I wasn't allowed to watch rated R movies, but the first rated R movie I ever ran off to see with my friends is one of my favorite horror movies, and I would go to a friend's house and he had all the rated R movies and he had all the the gory graphic video games and he listened to a lot of death metal and stuff, and so I really got all my bad influences out of away from home, which is it says a lot about how well I was raised, but at the same time, there's this component of rebelliousness that's inherent to every childhood. And I think when I have kids of my own, like I'm still gonna uphold the same standards and same kind of restrictions, I guess, and rules in my own house, but I'm not gonna freak out when I find out that my kid has gone to a friend's house and watched a movie with inappropriate content or whatever. See, now we're getting into child care and like parenting on this podcast, but it did go into the content that kind of molded my experience. So I couldn't go to Blockbuster with my parents and be like, "Hey, I want to watch Friday the 13th," which is why I didn't watch Friday the 13th until I was an adult. You know, I I didn't I actually never played the original Silent Hill until like 2 months ago. I'm like totally
Oh,
ashamed to
really?
say. Oh yeah, because when I was a kid, um, I wasn't allowed to play those games, and so what what adult or horror or bad quote unquote content that I might have watched with my family, with the guidance of my family, like other kids, I would go over to my best friend's house and his parents would just sit down and watch The Exorcist with him or like Event Horizon with him, and they were there to talk to them afterwards and make sure that they were okay psychologically. And I don't know if that's a good way or a bad way to raise a kid, but yeah, basically the horror content that shaped my own perception of horror when I was making Faith came from what I managed to sneak around and do. And so yeah, I never got to play the original Resident Evils or Silent Hill series until I had a car and I could sneak off to a friend's house or whatever. I remember basically my first exposure to survival horror was sneaking off to my girlfriend's house when I was in high school and playing Fatal Frame, because I had just finished watching The Ring and The Grudge. It was that weird era in the early 2000s when we wanted to make a lot of PG-13 um, U.S. versions of Japanese horror. So there's a lot of that going on. So I really enjoyed The Ring. I really enjoyed Faith, and uh, we find Fatal Frame at the rental store. Uh, there wasn't any Blockbuster anymore, but there was a place called Hastings where you could rent games for really cheap before Redbox came along and ruined everything. Um, Fatal Frame, based on a true story, it actually isn't. They just put that on the box for
Hmm.
no reason. Um, and and we turned it on. We played it all night, and we just played it. And then we played the second one, and that was my like relatively early on, later on in my childhood was when I really started getting into horror. But yeah, it's weird. There's movies that I just hadn't seen until I was adult. I didn't see the original Exorcist until maybe 2 or 3 years ago, just because I had these restrictions growing up. I do think it shaped faith and my games in a certain way, because I didn't watch or play what everyone was playing horror wise. And I'm really into obscure horror movies and obscure horror games. The more obscure, the better. And I like the mainstream horror stuff for what it is, but I tend not to get obsessed with it.
Hmm. Well, I understand that I've kept you a little bit longer than what we planned, so I do apologise for
Oh,
that.
whatever. I love talking, as you can see.
And I love listening. It's great, honestly. You've given us a really good insight into all of your processes and things. I've got a ton more questions that I'd love to ask you, but um, I'm hoping that maybe when you eventually release Faith Chapter 3, maybe you'll come back on and we can discuss that.
Yeah, absolutely. I have big plans for it. Um, I've hinted about this on my buddy's Twitch stream, but I will say this: uh, my roadmap for this year involves some pretty big stuff. So I am in the process of working with a publisher to get Faith. I can get Faith on Steam by myself, but um, I need a little more exposure than I feel like the games are getting on Itch and Game Jolt. So I am working. Yeah, so I'm not. I am satisfied, but I think I have higher potential than the exposure and traffic and um, revenue that I'm getting from Itch and Game Jolt. I'd like to. Faith is one of the top sellingest games on Itch.io, but I think it's time to kind of think bigger. And so I am currently looking for a Steam release and console releases this year. I'm really hoping that it works out.
Yeah, I think Steam is a really good step.
Yeah, and of course there's the mighty algorithm that I have to fight against and stuff,
Yeah.
but I think because Faith it's not an unknown. It has a fan base. People know about it, and there are so many. I'm only hitting, for one, I think PC games are only like 20% of the games market right now, and a tiny fraction of that is Itch and Game Jolt. So I currently only have access to a very microscopic sliver of the games industry or the games market. And there are so many players out there who either don't have the courage to steal their parents' credit card or don't have a credit card, so they play games on Steam with Steam gift cards. And so and that's something that I discovered. And so I really want to do a Steam release. I want to get it out to a wider audience, and I'm really interested in porting Faith to Switch. I don't know how it's going to work out. I don't know if Nintendo's going to go for a game with like blatant religious themes or imagery, but I think I can make it work. And this publisher that I'm talking to seems pretty confident that they can help me out. I'm going to do it. I'm going to release it all three chapters in one package basically, along with some extra stuff. That's the game plan right now. and I'm really excited that I get yeah, I'm really excited that I get to work on it starting Monday. I do a lot of creative contract work on the side, and I'm wrapping up a contract today and or tomorrow, and finally be able to get down to business on chapter three. So it's a little intimidating. There's a lot of pressure, but I'm really excited about it. And uh, depending on a few things, it might be something that I can just work on full time until about August, September, which I'm really excited about. So that's the game plan. That's the roadmap.
Well, I'm very, very interested in obviously your third rendition, and then you releasing them as a package also is going to be great. And trying to get them on Steam also is going to be fantastic because I've got a ton of friends that I've been saying to them, you guys, you got to play this game. And only one of them has managed to pick it up because that one is happy to go on itch.io. But the rest of them, it's just kind of, if it's not on Steam, then I can't be bothered, you know? And I
Yeah.
think that's
No, I know that.
yeah, it's a huge deal. I think a great deal of people are like that. And I really think that it would just take off even further than it has on Steam because, like you said, you've already got a decent foundation established. You've got people that are really interested. I guarantee a great percentage of people that already own the game on itch.io will also then go get it on Steam. Not just because it's a great game, but also just to support you as an indie developer and you yourself. So it's exciting. It's really exciting.
Yeah, it's an interesting time for me. Uh, from a personal standpoint, I'm having to make some uh, pretty big career uh, decisions. So I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to be able to have the time or the resources to do everything that I want to do on that roadmap, but I think that uh, I think that it'll work out. If I can take this summer and just really kind of dive in deep. Of course, you say that like creative work for me is so it's not a steady stream. It's something that kind of, like I said, it kind of builds up inside of me and then it just kind of gushes out at once. And so I really wanted chapter two. I was really blessed to release Faith in October during the Halloween. Uh, people were wanting to play a lot of scary games. Vinny on Vinesauce streamed Faith when it was basically unknown, and I owe a lot to him in that stream. And uh, but I was really disappointed in myself for not getting Chapter Two released in October. But man, it was just I just started a new job, and it just the game comes off as more confident, but I was not confident going into Chapter Two. I will say that. I was really doubting myself, and there were times when I was like, I don't know if this game is any good. Like, there are parts of it that work, there are parts of it that don't work, I don't think, and like I'm really afraid that this is going to be misinterpreted or that people are going to miss this. And um, I started thinking of a bunch of mechanics and features that were just kind of wasting my time, and then I would kind of second guess myself and stuff. So yeah, Chapter Two was a real creative struggle. Um, it's been really good after the fact now that it's released. But the game may come off as confident, but I certainly wasn't confident. So I really wanted to hit that October deadline, but I didn't. But it worked out. I had some content ready to go in October last year anyway that people seem to enjoy. And
Yeah, I was just gonna say because I'm an illustrator myself. Well, as well, I have a full time position, a full time job, but I'm an illustrator also, and I find that when I first started illustrating, I was very confident with my work, more so than I am now. That I think the more adept you get, the more skilled you get at a certain thing, the more you feel out of place, and maybe you don't deserve a place amongst others of the same or if not more caliber than yourself, and you start to get that imposter syndrome. Do you think that maybe
imposter syndrome, exactly.
yeah? Do you think that's kind of like what you started struggling with?
Yeah, I absolutely suffer from that. It came through a lot when I was in school, but especially when you get into research and like your professors that used to be your mentors now turn into your peers, and it really messed with my head. But yeah, I definitely suffer from that imposter syndrome. I'm deep down, I'm a very competitive person, and I compare myself constantly to others, um, and so that kind of contributes to that imposter syndrome that I feel. But Um, I have a folder that I put like the most glowing praise that I can find for my games. One of them being Markiplier's remarks on the Wind, because that guy's literally a hero of mine. I've been subscribed to him. He was the first YouTuber I ever subscribed to, and he's really the reason why I know so much about horror games, because I'd watch games that he would play, and then I would download them myself and play them. But I always I this may sound a little freaky, but I actually designed several parts of Faith with Markiplier in mind because I'd watched him for so long that I knew what freaked him out. Which is why there are mannequins all over the place in the basement of Faith, because Markiplier hates mannequins, and that's the reason why you get a scare when you pause the game when Michael shows up. Uh, and to hear him, of course, he didn't play Faith. He played The Wind, which I was really pissed about. He played the wrong game. But I understand what he's doing with all these short game series that he's doing. And he doesn't have, I don't think he has time anymore to do like real in-depth long plays of games that aren't like super popular. And I guess that's just one of the things that happens when you're super popular. But I specifically go back to his feedback for The Wind. Um, I burst into tears when I heard it for the first time. Uh, yeah, mostly. Yeah, I was going through a rough week anyway, and hearing that was a nice boost to my confidence. But just hearing from someone that I literally made the game for in a way, play one of my games and enjoy it that much, uh, when you consider the hundreds and thousands of games that he's played, um, it was really heartwarming. And so I have a folder of, it's kind of my pick me up folder that I'll thumb through when I start feeling that imposter syndrome and when I start feeling inferior. And the way I look at art, it's like no one's really better than anyone else. It's subjective to who's consuming the art. And there's popular art and there's not popular art. I do think there's objectively bad art, but it's like really hard to do. But um, but yeah, I just have to not let it get to me. You know, the first review that Faith ever got was a 1-star review, and it was like really unfair.
Oh wow,
And
really?
oh yeah, it's on my Facebook. He reviewed it. He gave it a 1-star rating. It was like, it's too hard. I move too slow. The boss is too hard. And it's not that he was wrong, but I later used that feedback to make the final boss, the fight with Amy Martin, uh, the potential to be easier. Um, and I eventually raised John's walk speed, because that, like, I don't even like it. I was just too lazy to change it for a while. But now he moves just as fast as he does in chapter 2, and I think people like it without noticing it. And yeah, I've gotten very little hate mail and very few bad reviews. Of course, that's all gonna change when I put on Steam, when it's when the exposure is magnified times 1,000.
I
But
think you'd be surprised.
um,
I think that you're going to have very few negatives. You're going to have negatives because everyone has a taste and some people just like to be dickheads. But I think you're going to be very surprised with the positive feedback.
Yeah, and some people don't like the graphics. They wanted something that has better graphics, and I'm like, did you see the screenshots? Like, you knew what you were getting
Yeah,
into.
yeah.
But that's okay. Um, so yeah, if I could wrap this up, I would say that it's been a great experience, and I'm very pleased with how Faith and Chapter 2 have turned out, and I have big plans in the future, and I hope that people stick around and remain patient and understanding. Because honestly, it's been great. I've never been one to feel like I had a community, besides my church and other things, but never really felt like I had a community where I like belonged. And to be part of the indie horror community, people are so supportive and so positive, and the players are so understanding, and it's just amazing. And I'm very, very happy to be a part of it. And I hope that I can continue making scary games for y'all for as long as I can.
I certainly hope that you continue, and I'm sure there are tons of other people that hope you continue. So I really appreciate you coming on. I had a really great chat with you. I've enjoyed every single second of it. Hopefully, we can get you on again at some point in the future.
Yeah, I think that'd be a good idea.
Yeah, great. I'll really look forward to it. Do you want to? Is there anything that you want to plug? Any sort of social media handles or anything at all?
Yeah, honestly, the best way to support me is to just buy the game on itch or Game Jolt. And if you've already purchased them and you still want to give me some compensation, then I have a PayPal at it's just airdorf@gmail.com. And I am always open. My DMs are always open on Twitter at Airdorf. I'm also on Facebook, although I hate Facebook, so I hardly use it anymore. Oh, they're terrible.
I agree.
Like pay for your posts to reach people when oh it's so terrible. And then you can always email me if you have questions or if you have feedback or stuff. Airdorf@gmail.com and yeah, that's pretty much it. It will eventually be on Steam. That's the goal.
Excellent. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much, Airdorf.
Yeah, thanks for your time. This was great.